At Focus on Liberia, we discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Dennis Job.
But if we don't address the governance challenges, it could undermine this framework. And if there are fiscal slippages, that means the government going back on its fiscal policy or the monetary authority going back on its policy, could also undermine this framework. And there's potential for continuing decline in extended aid, and if that compensated for on the domestic revenue mobilization, and that could also undermine the framework. So how can we translate this macroeconomic improvement and the positive outlook that we do have into quality jobs for Liberia? That's the question. That's the elephant in the room. And that's the problem that we have to solve on our last mile to 2030. When Liberia set out in 2012, the goal was to be a middle-income country by 2030. And we're staring at 2030. What can we do to be able to achieve some level of growth that will bring us close to that goal, if not better? And we can only do so by escaping the underdevelopment trap that we do have right now, and to be able to chart a new course for resilient growth. And that brings us to the topical issue that this edition of the Economic Update delved into. So to begin with, we want to talk about the structure of the economy. So this is the structure of the economy for the last 2 decades. Liberia, as you all know, came from war, and from 2024 to now, we've had peacetime. And this economy was heavily reliant on agriculture. There was just small industrial activity happening in 2004, and services was bearing the crust of the economy on the other end. And we've seen considerable structural transformation. The structure of the economy has changed in the last 2 decades. We saw a shift. Agriculture that was contributing 65% is now down to around 36%. The industrial sector has expanded its contribution from around 8 to around 24 now. And services now bears a bulk of the activity happening in the economy. But what does that say about this economy? Has this structural transformation come with massive job creation, or has it produced productive jobs for Liberians? That's the question. And if we look on the other end, what we've seen happen to employment is that we saw a transition of people from the agricultural sector or the primary sector straight to the tertiary or services sector. But what services are they? So these two sectors, agriculture and services, regardless of the fact that you see a considerable expansion in services, what is happening on the other end is that when you look at their output in terms of what they contribute to the economy versus the number of people in there who are employed, it points towards low productivity. So you have too many people in services, but they are contributing very less to the economy. And why is that? If you look at the services sector, it's predominantly driven by trade activity, some of transport activity, and so forth. And their contribution in terms of impact is very less. So this trend is not the trend we want to have. We want to have job creation happening, but job creation that use productivity to the extent that we'll be able to have inclusive and resilient growth over time. So just deepening on that, you look at the GDP or the output per person is employed, it's been flat over time. And why is that? There's only one sector that has been, having a higher level of productivity, and that's the industrial sector. And if we deeper into the industrial sector, which is the red line on the left side, if you deep into the industrial sector, basically what is happening there is mining. And mining is capital intensive. You and I do know. You're able to take just a number of people, and it has very little positive spillover to the rest of the economy. So as a result, the lower productivity in agriculture and services is weighing heavily on overall productivity within the economy. So it remains flat. And this has limited the country's overall income growth. So if you look on this side, you see that Liberia, which is the red dot you see on the right-hand side, is lagging the structural peers. Low-income country, regional, and other countries that share similar structure, as well as its aspirational peers, they are far behind their aspirational peers. So how do we push the limit? How do we break these barriers to be able to move forward? We can only do as much if we begin to have productive jobs, that yield higher level of productivity for the economy. And one of the issues that comes out clearly, if you look at the labor market dynamics, is the fact that the labor force is expanding. This is putting pressure on the authorities, on the country, on the private sector to be able to provide much more jobs. So if you look, we on average over the last 10 years or so, we had 55,000 new entrants to the labor force. And that's driven massively by the working age, the growth in the working age population. In the next 10 years, we expect that about a quarter of the current population will be reaching working age. And that raises the urgency for providing more jobs. So who's going to employ this working age population that we do anticipate? Government will be smaller in size, and we expect that the private sector should be able to absorb this growing working age population or this growing labor force. However, when we look at the structure, the current structure of Liberia private sector, it points to low potential in absorbing this huge workforce that is being anticipated. And why is that? If you look at the current structure of the private sector, firms that are employing less than 5 people account for a lion's share of the private sector. And firms that are employing anywhere between 5 to 19 accounts for the second largest share. So firms that are employing 100 plus people are less than 1%. So can this structure of the private sector absorb this growing workforce that's coming? That's the question that needs to be answered, and the only way we can start to solve this is to see what are the issues, what's holding back the private sector from being viable enough to absorb the growing labor force. That's part of the question we intend to answer. And if you look here on the other side, over the last 20 years, we have a stagnant wage employment. And wage employment, points towards quality job. And this has stagnated around 20% over the last 20 years. So a bulk of those employed are in vulnerable employment. So on the other hand, we need to have, emergence of productive firms to be able to absorb the labor force, current and future labor force. And when you look at the business creation rate or business establishment rate in Liberia, it's very low. It's very low. So Liberia can count 2 newly registered LLCs or limited liability company, per every 10,000 added population each year. That's very small. And when you look at comparators, looking in 2020, Liberia had 15 times fewer LLCs compared to its neighbor Sierra Leone and Guinea. And if we're looking at other explorational countries that we intend to see if we can emulate, that's about 25 times fewer. This is a picture that we have to change if we would need to absorb the workforce or growing workforce. Then we start to look at the spatial dimension to this. Montserrat is not Liberia. So we have 15 counties, and when you look at firm level employment that is happening, firm level employment is concentrated in areas that do have infrastructure and do have access to services. So in terms of spatial dimension, we'll see that rural-urban migration continue to happen, and where are they coming to be absorbed in the urban areas? They are basically going towards low productivity sector in services, mainly trade and transportation. When that labor could be used in other areas, like manufacturing or industries also, to be able to drive the country level of productivity. So the concentration is in Montserrat, and if you left Montserrat, a little bit in Nema, and you will see that those other areas that have access to services or infrastructure, they are not quite far from all of the other scarcely absorbing areas. So this is something that needs, so we need to deconcentrate services, and we need to make sure that we break the barrier of infrastructure to be able to absorb the labor force across the country. So how do we do that? The government has set out its own plan through the Arrest Agenda for Inclusive Development, and it's looking at economic transformation as the way forward. So within economic transformation, we can only transform the economy if we address some of the burning issues that are within the private sector and make sure that that is complemented with investment, public investment activity that is happening to unlock some of the potential of the economy. And that's the way forward to be able to improve the situation or address the job challenges. So the report suggests a coordinated strategy. So the country manager mentioned that earlier, but I'll just go over them. And one of those issues that we think has to be addressed head on the business environment issue. Why are we having a low business registration or business establishment rate? Because of the difficult business environment. So we ought to make sure that we enhance coordination. Some of the issues that are coordination failure, and that coordination has to happen between the public sector and the private sector. Much more conversation needs to happen, and this needs to be taken at a high level. So high level coordination, probably led by, top level in government to make sure that they understand what the issues are for businesses and to take actions to be able to address them. Also, our legal system, some of the laws are not favorable. We need to look at them, modernize them if need be, to be able to address some of the issues with the private sector. And public-private partnership, like the minister mentioned, is really needed to be able to sort out what's happening. How can we collaborate with the private sector to unlock the potential of the economy in ways that we're able to create more productive jobs, and in so doing, enhance productivity and become more resilient. So the second approach is to be able to enable the emergence and expansion of productive firms. So those firms who saw, like if you look at the smaller firms that are employing 5 to 19 people, what can we do to address some of the constraints that people who are in that category are facing to unlock their potential to be able to be stronger and productive enough to create, better space for absorbing the labor force. So we need to do that, and we can do this through regulatory reforms. We can do that through financial and technical support, technological support. All of these are needed. It has to be a package to be able to break the barrier for firms in that category to become much more productive. A third approach could be to expand the labor market participation. And this can happen through skill development, active labor programs, and entrepreneurship support. Why aren't we creating more Liberian entrepreneurs? That's the question we need to answer. They say a problem with our school curriculum, they say a problem with our skills development program. Do we have a labor support program that is helping people to get at the level where they become much more productive? These are all questions that we think needs to be answered or needs to be addressed to be able to enhance labor market participation, particularly for youth, but also for women. And lastly, we need to stimulate the labor demand through investments. And when we were talking about investment, what we based on previous studies and so forth, one of the areas that have potential is agro-processing, and another area is light manufacturing activity. So we stimulate the demand, the labor demand, by making sure that, in this area where we do think we have comparative advantage, much more of efforts is being exerted in this area to stimulate labor demand, be able to absorb the anticipated labor force and even the current one. So, the key takeaways. In the last 2 decades, we've achieved structural transformation, like many economies have done. But this has yielded mixed results. We've had uneven growth. In the first decade, we saw sustained growth, averaging around 7%, per year. But then in the last decade, from 2014 to 2023, we grew at just 1.4% per year. So that's coming from a sustained path and then a collapse. And this has been the story of Liberia, going through cycles of recovery, collapse, contraction, back to recovery. How can we change this paradigm by being resilient to be able to absorb those shocks that are putting us through these cycles? That's something that needs to happen. And if this happens, this can only happen if we address the job issues, because the jobs will create, the quality of job will make sure that we got a resilient workforce that will be able to enhance productivity over time. And when we look on the other side, look at all of the global indices, whether it's Global Competitive Index, or it's HBI, so most of those indices points towards the challenging business environment. So we need to turn the corner when it comes to addressing the issues, on business environment. This private sector that we do have, high-level vulnerable employment. How can we shift the dynamics to make sure that we correct some of we do course correcting in some areas in the private sector, while at the same time we provide support in ways that private sector will be able to thrive. So that's one way we think we can be able to enhance our business creation rate and so forth to be able to absorb this growing labor force. The labor force is expanding. This is something that raises urgency. You can do all you can and open up roads and so forth. You need to be able to absorb the labor force. And the only better way to do that is not through government, but through the private sector. And this should raise the urgency. So with notable progress in 2024 and the positive outlook for the next 3 years, how can we leverage this good time to be able to solve our job challenges? That's the question that policymakers, the development partners, the civil society, this is the question that has to be on our mind. And these are the issues that we need to think about to address. The AID is on that track, and it behooves a multi-stakeholder and coordinated approach to be able to achieve those objectives. So it calls for renewed commitment call for coordinated approach to the reforms and to be able to unlock the job potential of Liberia. So thank you very much. I'll stop here. And
At Focus on Liberia, we discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This.
We are Liberia. Liberia is our home. Liberia people. Liberia.